The thing nobody tells you about the Sovereignty Compact is that it was never really about peace. It was about performance. Every delegation, every signing, every ceremonial parade through the halls of Helix Station, it was theater. Carefully choreographed theater with real consequences if anyone missed their cue. I know because I was there for 3 years. Floor level. Badge clipped to my chest, coffee always going cold, data pads stacked to my chin. I worked logistics for the Human Diplomatic Auxiliary, which is a fancy title for the people who made sure the alien dignitaries didn't accidentally eat something that would cause a diplomatic incident. I'm not the hero of this story. I want to be clear about that up front. But I was standing close enough to see everything when it happened. And I've been thinking about it ever since. Helix Station sits at the intersection of 3 jump corridors, which makes it strategically important and aesthetically miserable. It was designed in the early expansion period when humanity was still trying to prove something, to itself mostly, and so the architecture has this desperate quality to it. Too much chrome, too many sweeping observation decks. The kind of building that shouts "we belong here" so loudly you can hear the anxiety underneath it. By the time the Vale Sovereignty delegation arrived for the compact renewal talks, the station had been running on emergency power for 6 days because of a coolant relay malfunction in grid sector 9. Half the ambient lighting was dead. The rest flickered at irregular intervals. The climate systems were cycling through temperatures like they couldn't make up their mind. One corridor would be warm and almost comfortable. Turn the corner and your breath misted in front of your face. Charming conditions for interstellar diplomacy. The Vale Sovereignty, for those who haven't done their reading, are not a gentle species. They're not aggressive either, not the way some are. They're something more unsettling than aggressive. They're correct. About everything, at least in their own estimation. They evolved in a low-gravity, high-radiation environment, which means their biology runs hot and their patience runs thin. They communicate in layered tonal frequencies, which our translation matrices handle adequately, but never perfectly. They have 7 social ranks that determine everything from the color of their environmental suits to how long they're permitted to pause before answering a question. They consider sustained eye contact from a lower rank to be either an act of submission or a declaration of hostility, depending on the angle. Learning all of this had been my job for 8 months before the delegation arrived. I could recite the rank structure in my sleep. I had literally recited it in my sleep. My bunkmate in crew quarters told me so, apologetically. There were 6 of them in the primary delegation. First Envoy Esreth Cahill was the one in charge, tall even by Vale standards, his environmental suit trimmed in deep violet to signal his rank, moving through the station corridors with the particular kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. Alongside him came 2 secondary delegates, an environmental specialist who seemed personally offended by our atmosphere, and 2 honor guards. The honor guards are the ones this story is really about. Vale honor guards, they call them the Vale Karun, which translates roughly as those who close the distance, are selected before they can walk. The process is genetic, physical, and psychological, and it takes approximately 23 years of continuous conditioning before they're considered ready for active deployment. What you end up with after all of that is not quite a soldier and not quite a machine. Something in between. Something that has been so thoroughly trained that the training has become the personality. They wear suits of reactive armor that shift color based on the wearer's physiological state. Calm is a deep, even black. Elevated stress shows as faint amber threading through the surface. Combat readiness goes full red gold. Both guards maintained perfect black throughout the arrival ceremony. I watched them. It was my job to watch them, technically, because anything that startled or alarmed a Vale honor guard would be logged as a protocol failure on my end. But I also watched them because there was something hypnotic about the stillness. Most beings in motion have some quality of being present, of engaging with their environment. These 2 moved through Helix Station like the station was a hologram they'd been briefed on. Real, technically, just not relevant to them. Their names, as given to us in the pre-arrival documentation, were rendered in standard as Kale Vor and Threndas. First Envoy Esreth Cahill walked between them at all times, 3 meters to his left, 3 meters to his right. If he stopped, they stopped. If he turned, they pivoted simultaneously without any visible signal passing between them. Watching them work was like watching a precision instrument operate. You couldn't find the mechanism, you just saw the output. Day 1 passed without incident. I filed my reports. The initial meet and greet went smoothly. A minor translation hiccup when one of our junior diplomats used a veil tonal phrase for "I am honored to meet you," but accidentally pitched it into the frequency that meant "I acknowledge your obvious superiority," which the veil delegation received with great satisfaction, so we called it a win. Esreth Cahal's honor guard stood at parade rest in the corner of every meeting room and said nothing. Moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped. Day 2 was when things started getting complicated. The complication arrived in the form of a 9-year-old girl named Myra Osei. Her mother, Dr. Amma Osei, was one of our station's lead atmospheric scientists, and Myra had been on Helix station for most of her short life. She knew the corridors better than the maintenance crews. She knew which observation windows had the best angle on the jump corridor shimmer, which commissary machine dispensed the hot chocolate that wasn't actually terrible, and apparently, though this was news to me, she had a habit of wandering into restricted access zones when she was bored. On the morning of Day 2, the main diplomatic corridor was technically restricted. We'd issued the notices, posted the barriers. The barriers were those retractable magnetic fence units that look very serious if you don't know you can step around the side because they only cover the center 2 meters of a 4-meter corridor. Myra knew. I don't know exactly how she ended up in that corridor. Later, her mother told me Myra had been heading to the observatory and taken the wrong junction, which I believe, mostly. Myra was 9 and she was curious, and the station was half dark and humming with the sound of malfunctioning climate systems, and I think she was probably following something interesting without thinking too hard about where her feet were taking her. What she found in Corridor 7 Bravo, Section 14, was First Envoy Esreth Cahal and his honor guards in transit between the initial briefing room and the secondary conference suite. I was 20 meters back. I saw Myra round the corner at about the same moment Kale Vor and Threndus processed her as an unexpected variable. They stopped. The envoy stopped behind them automatically because that's what the protocol dictated. The guards read threat levels, and the envoy responded to the guards. Both suits flickered briefly. Not amber. Just a quick strobe of something between their resting black and something else. A recalibration, I learned later, the suit's sensors trying to categorize what was standing in front of them. Myra stopped too. She looked at them. They were enormous by a child's scale. Kale Vor stood 2.3 meters. His suit added another few centimeters. The reactive armor had those subtle geometric ridge patterns that the Veil Karun use for differentiation. Rank markers, essentially. And in the flickering corridor lighting they caught the emergency strips and threw thin lines of amber and blue across the ceiling. She should have been scared. I was scared, and I was 20 meters away, and knew exactly what I was looking at. Myra tilted her head to the side. Then she said, and I heard this clearly, because the corridor was quiet enough that you could hear the ventilation ticking, "Your suit is moving." It was, the reactive surface of Kale Vor's armor had picked up some very faint rippling in the chest and shoulder sections. It wasn't combat response. It wasn't stress amber. It was something the suit's sensors were apparently processing as a novel input that didn't fit any pre-mapped category. Kale Vor said nothing. This was standard. Veil Karun don't engage with ambient stimuli. They assess and they maintain position. Myra watched the movement in his suit for another moment. Then she crossed the distance between them. I took a step forward. So did my colleague Benedict, who was stationed at the far end of the corridor. Neither of us was close enough to intercept without making a scene that would be significantly worse than whatever was already happening. She walked right up to Kale Vor and stopped about half a meter in front of him. He had to look down at an angle that probably strained some system in that neck assembly. She looked up at the same angle. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "The moving parts?" The translation matrix, which all diplomatic personnel wore as a small bead behind the ear, rendered this into veil tonal frequencies. I heard the double-layered echo of it in the corridor, that characteristic resonance that veil language has, like two sounds being spoken at once at slightly different depths. Kale Vor did not answer. Threndus had turned fractionally, not toward Myra, toward his partner, which was, I later understood, itself unusual. They're trained not to break the cordon geometry under almost any circumstance. Myra waited. She was apparently very comfortable with silence, which is something children either are or aren't, and she was. She just kept looking up at the suit, at the slow, rippling movement in the chest plate, and waited to see if an answer would come. Behind the guards, First Envoy Esreth Cahill had gone absolutely still. I want to be precise about that stillness, because it was different from the guards' stillness. The guards were still in the way of something waiting to act. The envoy was still in the way of something watching very carefully. Here's something I learned in my 8 months of study that doesn't make it into most of the official briefing materials. The Veil Karun's conditioning is almost total. The psychological reshaping is comprehensive enough that most external assessors conclude the guards have essentially no interior life that isn't mapped to duty and threat response. This is the conclusion that most researchers land on, and it's the conclusion that most diplomats operate from, which is why they treat the honor guards the way you'd treat a very sophisticated piece of security hardware. Respectfully, but not personally. The conclusion is wrong. What actually happens, and this is buried in the secondary literature, a paper by a xenopsychologist named Dr. Fen Cassol who spent 11 years embedded with a Veil diplomatic mission, is more complicated. The conditioning doesn't erase interior experience. It compartmentalizes it, roots it, buries it under layers of behavioral protocol that are so deeply grooved they've become automatic. The guards aren't empty. They're locked. And the thing about something that's locked, Cassol argued in her paper, is that the very depth of the locking tells you something about what's behind the door. I'd read that paper, I'd read it 3 times. I thought it was interesting in an academic sense. I didn't know I'd be watching the door crack open in a flickering corridor on Helix Station, while a 9-year-old waited for an answer about whether it hurt. What happened next is difficult to describe without sounding like I'm exaggerating, and I'm not exaggerating. Cailvor lowered himself. Not quickly, not in a single motion. He went down by gradual degrees, first one knee touching the floor, then the other, so that he was kneeling, bringing his eye level down toward something closer to Myra's height. It wasn't a combat posture. It wasn't any posture in any Veil Karun manual that I'd been given access to. It was just he came down to where she was. The suit's reactive surface was doing something genuinely strange by this point. The rippling I'd first noticed in the chest plate had spread. Slowly, across the shoulder assembly, down the arms, through the midsection, not amber, not red. Something I'd never seen documented, a very faint, very deep blue threading through the black like veins of light, fine as wire, spreading from the chest outward like a map being drawn. Threndus was completely still, but both of his primary visual sensors, the large lenses that dominate the Veil Karun helmet's face section, had rotated a fraction toward his partner. Myra watched the blue lines spread. "It's making a pattern," she said. Like when you're cold and you look at a window and there's ice on the outside in the morning." She paused. "My dad showed me that before." She said before the way children say it when they mean something that changed, and they haven't found the full sentence for it yet. Cailvor was at her level now, or close enough. His helmet, that blank, geometric, entirely unreadable surface, was maybe 60 centimeters from her face. She reached out. I think I genuinely believe that she was going to touch the armor, to see if the blue lines were warm or cold the way a child touches a frosty window, just to know. Her hand got within maybe 15 centimeters before she stopped herself. Because something in Cailvor's posture changed. Not threatening, not a flinch. It was subtler than that. The reactive armor across his upper chest compressed slightly, a genuine physical response in the material, not a display, like something underneath it had drawn a very careful breath. Myra's hand stayed where it was, extended, not quite touching. "Does anyone ever ask you that?" she said, "if it hurts?" The translation matrix rendered it. The corridor was absolutely silent. I don't know how to convey this next part in a way that will land correctly, so I'm just going to say what I observed and let you make of it what you will. The blue lines in Cailvor's armor gathered, slowly. The way they'd been spreading outward, they now moved inward, converging toward the center of his chest plate. And as they converged, they brightened. Still deep, still that faint cold blue, but concentrated now, a small constellation of light in the center of all that black reactive surface. And then, for the first time since the delegation had arrived on Helix Station, Vor spoke. His voice, filtered through the suit's vocalization system and then through my translation bead, came as two sounds simultaneously, the way Veil speech always does. But where Esreth Cahill's voice had a quality of authority, of practiced performance, Vor's voice had something else. Something unpolished. Something that sounded like a word said quietly in a room where you thought no one was listening. "No," he said, "no one has asked." I filed 12 separate reports about what happened next. That's not a joke. Protocol required documentation at each stage, and what followed in Corridor 7 Bravo over the next 11 minutes generated more paperwork than the entire first day of the compact renewal talks. First Envoy Esreth Cahill made a sound. "This is in my official report. 3 xenolinguistic specialists have since reviewed the recording I captured on my badge-mounted sensor array. They've listened to it dozens of times. The closest they can render it in standard is something like a sustained tonal intake, the Veil equivalent of being caught off guard. Not distress, not alarm. Surprise, genuine surprise, from a being whose entire professional life is built around never being surprised." He had been watching Vor, and now he took 3 steps forward, past his own guard, which was, I cannot stress this enough, not something Veil envoys do during active corridor transit. The guards exist to maintain a protective geometry around the envoy. The envoy moving into the space between the guards collapses the geometry entirely. You could see Threndus process this, the subtle recalibration in his stance as the entire architecture of their movement protocol failed to account for what was happening. Esreth Cahill came and stood beside Vor. He looked down at Myra. His suit was violet, envoy rank. Unreadable in the way that very high Veil social rank learns to be unreadable, a different kind of blank from the guard's blank, more deliberate, more constructed. But I was watching carefully. I had 3 years of watching carefully behind me. There was something happening around his secondary visual array, the smaller sensors that flank the main lenses on a Veil environmental suit. They were rotating in very small arcs, back and forth. Myra, Vor, Myra, Vor. "Small human," he said. "Through my translation matrix this came as young one, but the xenolinguistics team later told me the actual phrasing was closer to one who is early. How did you come here?" "I took the wrong junction," Myra said. Well, he made a sound, "and you are not frightened." It wasn't a question. He was assessing. "I'm a little frightened," Myra said, "but your friend was moving his suit and I wanted to know why." My Esreth Cahill stopped. He turned to look at Vor, who was still kneeling, still at her level, still with that gathering of blue light in the center of his chest plate. "He is not." Another stop. Then, surprisingly, he started again with different words. "We do not have a word for what he is to me. The closest your language would come is the one I trust to stand at my edge." "Like a best friend," Myra said. Long pause. "Yes," Esreth Cahill said. "I believe that is close enough." Benedict reached me somewhere around that point. He'd come up from his position at the far end of the corridor, moving quietly, professional enough not to make the approach into a production. "Should we intervene?" he murmured. I looked at the scene in front of us. First Envoy Esreth Cahill, one of the most senior diplomatic figures in the Veil sovereignty, standing in a malfunctioning corridor on a human space station, talking to a 9-year-old about the nature of friendship. His honor guard kneeling on the floor with blue light mapping itself slowly across his chest plate. "Absolutely not," I said. Benedict looked at me. "If we walk into that right now," I said quietly, "we will be the most memorable thing that happened in this corridor, and the memory will not be good." He stayed where he was. Good man, Benedict. Myra had turned her attention back to Vor. "What's your name?" she asked. He told her. The actual Veil vocalization, I have it in the recording, is a specific double-tonal phrase that doesn't translate perfectly into a single standard word. The Matrix rendered it as Vor. But the xenolinguistics team told me later that the real meaning of the name, broken into its tonal components, is closer to something like the one who holds the line when the line is threatened. "I'm Myra," she said. "My dad called me his little star. He's not here anymore. He was on the perihelion mission." The perihelion mission. I knew about the perihelion. Everyone on Helix station knew. It was an exploratory survey that had gone wrong in a jump corridor 18 months ago. They'd recovered some of the crew, not all of them. I watched Kael'vor receive this information. The blue light in his chest plate pulsed once. A single, slow expansion and contraction, like a slow heartbeat visible from the outside. "I am sorry," he said. His voice still had that unpolished quality, like someone remembering how to use words for a purpose beyond reporting and confirming. "It's okay," Myra said, with the particular resilience of children who have made peace with something enormous because they had to. "Mom says he's still out there somewhere, in the jump corridor, like he's traveling." She looked at the blue lines that were still threading gently through his armor. "Is that what your suit does when you're sad?" she asked. "The blue." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we do not veil Karun or not." He stopped. Started again. "The suit responds to what is inside," he said. "We are trained so that it does not." "But it's doing it anyway," Myra pointed out. "Yes," he said. "That's okay," she said. "I cry sometimes and I try not to. It happens anyway." The blue light in his armor pulsed again. I have spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what that moment was, what the correct analytical framework is for it. I've read more xenopsychology since then than I read in my entire preparation period. I've talked to people who study the veil. I've talked to people who study the veil Karun specifically, which is a much smaller and more frustrated group of researchers because the access is so limited. The best I can offer is this. Kael'vor had been conditioned for 23 years. 23 years of systematic suppression, not destruction, suppression. The conditioning roots the interior experience, the feeling, the response, the thing that makes a being a person rather than a mechanism deep underneath the behavioral architecture. Buries it under layers of protocol that are so automatic they feel like nature rather than training. But underneath all of that, something. Something that responds when it's addressed. Something that surfaces when the right kind of attention finds it. Not a weapon, not a diplomat, not a piece of security hardware. A person who had been, for 23 years, never directly spoken to. And a 9-year-old girl who had no briefing materials and no xenolinguistics preparation and no strategic objective whatsoever, had simply walked up and asked if it hurt. And the person underneath, the conditioning, had, apparently, been waiting for exactly that. The conversation continued for another 7 minutes. I'm going to tell you what I remember because the recordings capture words and sounds, but not the full texture of it. The way the flickering corridor lights made everything slightly dreamlike. The sound of the climate system cycling distantly. The faint smell of recycled air that every station has. The particular quality of silence that descends when everyone in a space understands that something significant is happening, and no one wants to be the one to break it. Myra asked Kael'vor what he could see from inside the helmet. He told her, with what I can only describe as careful honesty, like someone thinking through an answer rather than retrieving it from a pre-approved list, that he could see more than she might expect. The suit's sensor array processed 17 different spectrographic ranges simultaneously. He could see the heat signatures of every person in the corridor. He could see the electromagnetic trail of the station's faulty grid sector 9 rippling through the walls. He could see the micro-vibrations in the floor from the ventilation system 4 decks below. "That sounds like a lot," Myra said. "It is," he said. "The training teaches you to process it without," he paused. "Without experiencing it." "What does it look like when you just look?" she said. "Like when you're not doing the training." Another pause, longer. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't looked that way in a long time." "Oh," she said, then after a moment, "I bet it's beautiful." The blue light in his chest plate spread again. All the way to the edges of his armor this time, all the way to the shoulder joints and the upper arms and the neck assembly. A full illumination, that deep cold blue, overlying all that trained unreadable black. The suit was telling the truth even when he couldn't. First Envoy Esreth Cahill made that sound again, the tonal intake, the surprise but softer this time. He said something in Veil that my translation matrix struggled with. The xenolinguistics team later rendered it as, "I have stood with you for 19 years, and I have never seen the suit do that." Kael'vor looked at him, then back at Myra, then slowly back at his envoy. "I know," he said. Something passed between them. I can't tell you what it was because I couldn't see their faces, and I don't speak Veil well enough to read the subtonal frequencies. But Threndas, who had been maintaining his position through all of this with the particular rigid stillness of someone performing normalcy in very abnormal circumstances, made a very small movement. His head turned toward Kael'vor, his primary lenses focused. And then barely, faintly, so subtle I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching so carefully, the surface of Threndus's armor flickered blue. Just once, just for a moment. Like a response, like recognition. Like someone saying, I see it too. It ended, as these things do practically. My comm bead vibrated. Secondary conference suite was waiting. The schedule didn't care what was happening in Corridor 7 Bravo. I walked forward. Benedict walked forward. We came into the scene professionally, calmly, because that's the job. I introduced myself to First Envoy Esreth Cahill with the correct tonal inflection for I am your designated logistics coordinator, and I mean no disrespect by approaching. He received it with a slight incline of his head. Both honor guards came back to their standing positions. Kael'vor rose from the floor smoothly, the motion exact and controlled, and as he rose, the blue light in his armor faded slowly back into the resting black, like a tide going out. Myra stood there and watched. I have to go, Kael'vor said to her. Okay, she said. Myra, he paused. The pause had the quality of something being chosen carefully. Your father, he was traveling, as your mother said, that is... Another pause. That is a good way to understand it. Myra nodded. She seemed to take this seriously, which I think she did. Kids often take things more seriously than adults expect. Will you come back to Helix Station? She asked. Like after the talks. I do not know, he said. The envoy's schedule determines. The envoy's schedule, Esreth Cahill said, from slightly behind them with what I can only describe as deliberate dignity, has flexibility. Kael'vor turned toward him. Yes, Esreth Cahill said. I am deciding that now. I filed my reports that evening. All 12 of them. The Incident Review Board classified it as a low-level protocol deviation with no adverse diplomatic consequences, which is technically accurate, in the sense that calling a thunderstorm precipitation is technically accurate. What I put in the unofficial section, the part that goes to the senior diplomatic analysts who actually read things, was different. I wrote about the blue light. I wrote about the kneeling, and the 7 minutes, and the way Threndus's suit had flickered in the corridor. I wrote about what Esreth Cahill had said, the schedule has flexibility, and what that meant, coming from a first envoy who had not deviated from a prepared diplomatic schedule in 19 years of active service. I wrote, something happened today that I don't have a clean category for. A child asked a simple question, and a being who had spent 23 years being trained not to have an interior experience had one anyway. And the being standing next to him, the most senior diplomatic figure in the Vale sovereignty, a politician and a strategist and a person who has navigated interstellar relations for 2 decades, stood there and watched it happen and adjusted his schedule. I think the word for that is hope. I think the thing that happened in Corridor 7 Bravo, Section 14, on Helix Station during Day 2 of the Compact Renewal talks, was the specific thing that makes people, all kinds of people, with all kinds of conditioning and all kinds of histories, keep bothering to talk to each other. The Compact Renewal talks concluded successfully 6 days later. This is in the public record, widely reported, considered a major diplomatic achievement by most of the analysts who covered it. What is not in the public record is the addendum. Attached to the final signed document, in a subclause that most of the press didn't catch because it was written in Vale tonal notation, and the standard translation was buried in Appendix 9, was a new provision. Esreth Cahill had proposed it on Day 4. The human delegation had agreed within the hour. It established a cultural exchange program. Specifically, a program by which Vale personnel posted to diplomatic stations would participate in what the document called ambient social integration, which is a very formal way of saying they would be present in shared spaces, outside of ceremonial contexts, where they might encounter station inhabitants going about their lives. The program was described in the document as a pilot initiative for improved bilateral understanding. I helped draft the language. I know what it was really for. I was in Corridor 7 Bravo when it started. The Vale Karun who participated in the first cycle of the program, I was told by a xenopsychologist colleague who was brought in to observe, were notable for one specific documented phenomenon. Their suit colors over the course of the integration period showed increased variance from resting black, more amber, more of the intermediate frequencies, and in several cases that deep cold blue. The researchers called it expanded emotional display. I think the more honest description is, they started to show what was there. Myra came to see me the day after the delegation departed. She knocked on the door of my logistics office, which is small and full of stacked data pads, and has a window that faces the service corridor rather than the observation deck, which tells you everything you need to know about the career progression of logistics coordinators. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. She looked around my office the way kids do, cataloging things without pretending not to. Then she sat down in the chair across from my desk. "Did the big ones leave?" she said. "Yesterday," I said, "the whole delegation." She nodded, and I could see her processing this. Kids have this quality of processing things visibly, where you can watch the thought move through them before they decide what to do with it. "He said the schedule had flexibility," she said. "He did. Does that mean they'll come back?" "There's a good chance," I said. I wasn't just being kind. The addendum was real. The pilot program was real. Actually, probably yes. She considered this. Then she looked at the window onto the service corridor, where a maintenance worker was moving past with a repair cart, and then she looked back at me. "He was really sad," she said, "underneath Kael'vor." "I think so," I said, "yes." "But he didn't know anyone knew," she said, "because nobody asked." I thought about that, about the 23 years, about Dr. Cassal's paper and the locked door and the thing behind it, about the way Threndus's armor had flickered blue just once at the far edge of my attention. "No," I said. "I don't think anyone had." Myra nodded. She sat with that for a moment. "That's sad too," she said, "being sad and nobody knowing." "Yeah," I said, "it is." She got up to go, because she had the particular economy of children who say the thing they came to say and then feel no need to elaborate. At the door she paused. "I hope they fix the corridor lights," she said. "The flickering ones, it made his suit look nicer, but it's kind of spooky." She left. I sat in my office for a while after that, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. I've told this story a few times now, to colleagues, to the xenopsychologist friend. Once at a dinner that went longer than expected, to a table of people who work in interstellar relations and spend a lot of time talking about strategy and posture and the calibrated performance of cooperation. The response I get most often is something like, "That's remarkable," or "What a coincidence," or, from the more analytical end of the room, "That's a fascinating data point for Vale Karan emotional architecture." What I never quite manage to explain, what I keep trying and keep falling slightly short of, is the specific quality of those 11 minutes. The thing I keep coming back to is this. She barely laid a hand on him. She extended her hand and stopped 15 centimeters away and never made contact. She didn't touch the armor. She didn't do anything that, in a tactical sense, could be described as a physical intervention. But something cracked open anyway, because she stood at the right distance and asked the right kind of question. Not a diplomatic question, not a strategic question, not the kind of question you ask when you're trying to get something or manage something or document something for your 12 reports. Does anyone ever ask you that, if it hurts? The simplest question, the one that treats the being in front of you as a being, rather than as a category, a threat, a barrier, a process, a piece of security hardware. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Because whatever the conditioning, whatever the 23 years, whatever the trained, unreadable surface, underneath all of it, there was someone waiting to be seen. And a small human girl, who took the wrong junction on her way to the observatory, saw him. The corridor lights in Section 14 were fixed on day 3 of the talks. The maintenance team finally located the relay failure. Even light, steady, the way it's supposed to be. I walked through that corridor on day 3, and it was just a corridor again. Clean lines, functional lighting, the smell of filtered station air. Nothing remarkable about it. But I slowed down when I passed the spot. You do that sometimes, after something happens somewhere. You slow down when you pass the place, because the place has changed even if nothing looks different. You walk through the ordinary version of it, and you carry the other version with you. I carried it. I still do. There's a line in Dr. Casal's paper that I keep thinking about. It's in the conclusion section, which most people skip, in a part where she's writing about the implications of her findings for interspecies contact in general. She says, approximately, I'm paraphrasing because I'm not willing to reproduce her exact phrasing, that the deepest barrier to understanding between species is not difference. It's the assumption of difference. The assumption that the gap is too wide, the architecture too alien, the interior too inaccessible. She says the assumption protects us from effort. She says the effort, when we make it, almost always finds something. I read that 3 times before I came to Helix Station. I thought it was idealistic. I thought it was the kind of thing you write in a paper when you have enough data to feel hopeful, but not enough real-world exposure to have the hopefulness knocked out of you. I still think she was idealistic. I also think she was right. The last thing I want to tell you about is something that happened on the final morning of the compact talks, during the formal departure ceremony. It was brief, the kind of thing that, if you blinked, you missed. First Envoy Esreth Cahill was moving through the departure corridor with his honor guards flanking him. 3 meters left, 3 meters right, the geometry restored to perfect calibration. Somewhere in the crowd of station personnel who'd gathered in the corridor for the official send-off was Myra Osai, standing beside her mother at the back, small enough that she was mostly hidden by the people in front of her. Cale Vore spotted her. I don't know how. The sensor array in his helmet, maybe, the 17 spectrographic ranges, the heat signatures, the ability to see things most beings would miss. Or maybe something else, some other kind of attention. He didn't break stride. The cordon geometry held. Esreth Cahill kept moving and Cale Vore kept pace, 3 meters to his left, exactly where he was supposed to be. But as he passed the point in the corridor that was closest to where Myra was standing, the reactive surface of his armor did something. Just in the chest, just briefly, a pulse of that deep cold blue, concentrated and clear, that came and went in the span of 2 seconds. Like a small light turned on and then off. Like someone saying, I see you, I will remember. Myra lifted her hand. Not a wave, just a lift. The way you acknowledge something across a room when words aren't the right instrument. Then they were gone, down the departure corridor through the locks into the shuttle bay. And the corridor was just a corridor again. I work in logistics on Helix Station. I make sure delegations don't accidentally eat things that cause diplomatic incidents. I file reports. I drink cold coffee. I stand in corridors and watch and document and try to make sure nothing goes wrong. Something went wrong on day 2 of the compact renewal talks. Or more precisely, something went sideways. Something happened that wasn't in any protocol. Something that nobody planned and nobody could have planned, because you can't plan the moment when a 9-year-old girl takes the wrong junction and walks straight into the gap between what we perform and what we are. The talks concluded successfully. The compact was renewed, the addendum passed, the pilot program is running, the analysts are writing papers. And in Corridor 7 Bravo, Section 14, the lights work fine now. But I still slow down when I pass it. Because that's where it happened. That's where she extended her hand, not quite touching, and the armor cracked open. And on the other side, there was someone who had been waiting a very long time to be real. She barely laid a hand on him, and everything changed.